Every problem seemed solved. Underneath the beauty, workers who were completely exhausted, whose family life was so disastrous that the Republican politicians who pushed all of this could stay in power by positioning themselves as the champions of those families that had fallen apart because of what the Republicans did. But the Republicans were the ones who wanted to bring you back to the little old town and the nice church and happy mommy. They were the ones to protect you against the consequences of what they had done. That's a smart political move. That's right. That's really brilliant. You make the changes that collapse the family and present yourself as the champion of the good old family that's falling apart. And you point at the Democrats as the ones who somehow bear responsibility. It's a genius of Republican politics. But we have an exhausted working class, can't work anymore, and we now have an anxiety-ridden working class because their debts are unsustainable. Unsustainable. The combination of advertising and all this history made people borrow who couldn't pay it back. That could have been foreseen. It's nothing new. And with you put together the desperation of the American working class given that history, and the efforts of the finance industry to scrounge out every conceivable borrower, the idea that you would lend money to people who couldn't pay it back, that's not a tough call. But the system was premised that that wouldn't happen. And so when it did, nobody was prepared. The banks who had financed it, the clever new instruments, whether they were derivatives or mortgage-backed securities or collateralized debt obligations or credit default swaps or any of the mechanisms that were invented, they all depended in the end on the ability of these endless loans to be repaid, and of course that didn't happen. But it didn't happen because banks were crooked. Were they crooked? Of course they were. They're always crooked. It's only a question of degree, and in this Wild West scenario they were a bit more crooked than usual. When the banks made their loans, they got credit ratings. Some of you know about this. A AAA rating, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, Fitch's, the three big companies. So the banks went to them and said, we'd like you to do an objective study of this security and then give it a AAA rating, which they all complied, they did. And so they were able to market it to people who thought it was secure when it wasn't. That's not new. These people have all been around the block. That's a typical problem. Nothing, the discovery by the press that there's been corruption in the air is crazy. This was a system built to fail, to reach its end when the combination of exhaustion physically and emotional anxiety from the debt made people unable to continue. And those people are now, by the millions, walking away from those obligations, and the house of cards comes down. Part two, that's part one. Part two, what do you do about this situation as it implodes around us? I don't know what the market is today, but at 2:30, when I walked into my last class, I got a telephone call that the stock market was down another 300 points, so I don't know, still. So the big bounce that was expected for today was exactly as robust as all the other predictions about what would happen after all the other little bailouts before this last big one. What is going to happen? Well, there are three kinds of ways of dealing with this, and I'll stop with that. One is conservative, one is the liberal, at least what we call liberal in this society, and one is a socialist alternative I'd like to present for you to think about. The conservatives these days are in a tough spot. It's hard for them. And I want to be honest with you, I'm enjoying it immensely. I do. I don't want to pretend otherwise. The story of how markets and private enterprise interact in such a way as to produce wonderful outcomes is, even for them these days, a cause for gagging. But of course, ever resourceful, there are always conservatives who will rise to the occasion, and some of them are rising now, sort of like dead fish. And they are reaching the conclusion that the reason this all happened is because of governmental intervention in the free market. If only the government hadn't done, and then they rattle off 20 things that the government did over the last 20 years, which indeed it did, and then they try to draw a line between those things the government did and this disaster now, to reach the conclusion that the reason we have this problem is too much government intervention. That's as predictable as arguing that sometime over the next 2 months there will be rain, and then claiming, having made this proposal, that the next 2 days from now, when it rains, it's because you understood the mechanism. So that's what conservatives will do. And that's what they are doing. But these days, they get almost nowhere with this. Even the mainstream press has a hard time with this sort of stuff. That's why people like us are in the press suddenly in America. What about the other, the liberal left? This is much more interesting to me and much more important, and is where I want to focus my attention. Liberals, social democrats, leftists, progressives, a lot of words, they seem to be in favor of regulation. They seem to find the problem that the banks weren't regulated, that these credit rating companies weren't regulated, that the Federal Reserve didn't regulate better or differently or more or something. Regulation. Regulation. Paul Krugman wants regulation. My colleagues in this department, no, heaven forbid, not, but a good number of them want regulation. Liberal commentators want regulation. Leftists I talk to want regulation. The salaries should be regulated not to be so high. And the greed should be regulated. All kinds of things should be regulated. I find this astonishing. Not even astonishing, depressing. And let me tell you why. In the 1930s, the last time we had a capitalism hitting the fan in this way, we produced a lot of regulation. Social Security didn't exist before then. Unemployment insurance didn't exist before then. Mass government hiring of people to do all kinds of things didn't exist before then, etc. So we had a lot of regulation. Banks were told you can do this, but you can't do that. Insurance companies were told you can do that, but you can't do that. Lots of constraints and limits on corporations. All these regulations had a particular quality that I want to focus your attention on. They limited what a board of directors of a corporation could do 10 ways to Sunday. They taxed them. They did all kinds of things that annoyed, bothered, and troubled boards of directors. And you would be no great genius to understand that a board of directors, encumbered by all these regulations, would have the idea, let's try to evade them. Let's try to undermine them. Let's try to get rid of them. And that they would probably go to work on that project about as soon as the regulation was passed, if not sooner. So it's very interesting that the regulations we had imposed here in the United States by Franklin Roosevelt and all the people who made that happen had an interesting quality. They did not take away from the board of directors the freedom nor the opportunity to undo all the regulations and reforms. These were a set of regulations that left in place an institution with every conceivable incentive to undo and erase the regulations. But that wasn't the worst of it. They also left in place a board of directors who, as the first appropriators of all the profits produced in our system, thereby had the resources with which to realize what the system gave them as incentives. They had the wealth to undo the regulations, because these peculiar regulations left them in that position. It literally invited its own enemies to do their thing. And, although I know it comes as a surprise to some of my liberal friends, the boards of directors, with the incentive to undo the program and the resources to realize their objectives, did so. You and I have lived through the last 30 years in which the boards of directors of the United States' larger corporations used their profits to buy the president and the Congress, to buy the public media, and to wage a systematic campaign from 45 to 75. The basic game was evade them. And after 1975, get rid of them. And it worked. That's why we're here now.